Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Executive Compensation Podcast. Today, very excited to have David Bixby and Andrew Stancel here on the show, and we're going to be talking about best practices for compensation committee meeting process. And so to kick us off, David, can you share why it's so important to really get some best practices in place when it comes to this process?
Yes. So, executive compensation decision-making itself is a process that's kind of inherently fraught with conflict. Executive compensation decisions are increasingly subject to external scrutiny, potentially criticism. And there are a lot of places that the process can go off the rails. And the compensation committee meeting, where decisions are being made, is something that happens just a few times per year, right? You get a few opportunities to get key decisions made and made well. And trying to manage that process appropriately is critical to making sure that you make the most of that time that you're given. Because when it goes wrong, you can end up with reactive decision-making, reputational harm, potentially, internal conflict, and eventually, of course, declining performance, which is really what all of the executive compensation is about, driving the right performance. So what we wanted to do is kind of share with you some of the processes we've seen or put in place with some of our clients that can help make the most of that compensation committee meeting time.
Yeah, that's incredible. And yeah, definitely we hit on a lot with a lot of these episodes. It's a lot of big decisions, a lot of ways to look at it, a lot of ways to approach it. So having a process to explore all of this, definitely very important. So I guess, Andrew, can you maybe kick us off with, what are some of the processes that committees you work with use really to effectively manage through these complexities?
Yeah, sure. So when we talk about process, it's really just as simple as having a series of actions or steps and tools in place to help achieve good decision making. These processes are just as important as the substance and the technical requirements around executive compensation. There are a few key process and tools that we see committees using, namely around keeping annual calendars, having a regular meeting cadence, setting topics and agendas, determining who's involved in the meetings and who's going to approve what. Let me give you an example. One process in particular that we think is really important is communication. I can't stress that word enough. It's all about having open and direct communication between the chair of the committee, the HR team, and the CEO, and the compensation advisor. It's really critical to making and documenting appropriate compensation decisions. Open communication really builds a relationship of trust that allows management and the committee to raise concerns for discussion with each being comfortable that both sides will work towards an appropriate outcome. It's really particularly important on issues where the committee and management may have different perspectives on a particular issue.
Yeah, I agree, Andrew. I think if I would pick one thing out of the list, a number of the things that we have here come back to communication in various forms. It's about keeping that open communication going. And as you mentioned, it's particularly important in building trust and helping to discuss some decisions that are more fraught with challenges, right? Where management and the committee may have a difference of opinion. And sort of a specific way to think about that communication process in those situations is taking two bites at the apple. Right? So when you have particularly challenging decisions like an incentive plan redesign or goal setting, particularly if there are new goals being set in the annual or long-term incentive plan. Trying to make sure that you get to the right plan design or the appropriately challenging goals sometimes requires a process where you review or take one bite at the apple in one meeting where there's no approval on the table, and then allowing some time for the compensation committee to think about it, to provide direction, for management to incorporate that direction into a final recommendation, so that when you get to a meeting where a decision has to be made, you're hopefully just making some tweaks at that point, and nobody feels rushed or that they are sort of backed into making a decision that they're not ready to make. And I think it's a good process for some of the more challenging and detailed decisions that the committee has to make.
I completely agree with you, David. And just to build on that for a second, an example of two bites at the apple approach for, say, an item that's like a significant incentive design change might be something like this. At a summer meeting where the agenda is maybe a little bit lighter, management would come forward with proposed changes to the incentive design and the metrics, and usually with some alternatives that are presented to the committee for feedback. So the proposal gets socialized with the committee provides management with feedback, and then management goes back to the drawing board, and maybe at the fall meeting, they'll come back with more of a finalized incentive design and metrics that they present for approval with the committee. So the incentive design has taken 2 meeting cycles, a summer and a fall meeting cycle. And then on top of that, at the next meeting in the new year, say at a February or March meeting, management might actually will actually bring actual targets for the metrics for the new design to the committee for approval. So you've got a whole process that has taken, in this example, not only 2, but almost 3 bites of the apple.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's, I mean, 2 bites, 3 bites, you can reach a point where you get decision fatigue, but you do definitely want to provide the committee enough time to think carefully and provide direction about some of those more challenging decisions.
That makes a ton of sense there on just the communication, multiple bites of the apple. Definitely 2 great processes to help with this entire meeting process. Another kind of role we've talked about briefly is the chair, and what role really should they play, and how can they be effective to help support the meeting process?
Yes, having the committee chair review materials before posting materials really helps with resolving resolvable or challenging issues before getting to the committee meeting. That process really helps save committee time at the meeting, and it really ensures that the committee focuses its time on more substantive issues and concerns. Ideally, this review process with the committee includes a few key steps, such as having an agenda review with the committee chair 3 or 4 weeks in advance of the meeting. It involves management and HR sharing materials with the committee chair and the committee's advisor before the materials are posted to the rest of the committee or the board. This usually starts with an exchange of any written materials and illustrations with management providing their materials to the advisor. And if the advisor is involved in preparing any materials, the advisor providing those materials to management as well. And then once those materials are shared, ideally it's followed up with a call between the chair, management, and the advisor to review and discuss those materials. That really helps to ensure that key issues are discussed. Any factual issues or errors get resolved. Maybe alternative approaches are discussed and considered. So it's really about reviewing, enhancing, and finalizing those draft materials before they're shared with the rest of the committee.
Yeah, and I think it's also, I think you mentioned in there, important for the committee chair to take the time to prime the pump, if you will, on some issues with the rest of the committee. So they get a preview, they can help refine it, and then they can also help prepare the committee to lay the groundwork for the conversation that's going to happen in the committee meeting. Having an engaged committee chair, as you can see, is extremely valuable. And getting them to review, provide input and guidance on materials is critical to that meeting going smoothly.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And it's really about the committee chair leading the discussion. I think the committee chair's objective is to keep all the members of the committee on track and on focus on the key issues. I don't think it's the committee's chair to dominate or drive to a particular outcome, but rather help the committee come to a consensus on a particular issue.
Right. That's an important distinction. I agree.
That's super helpful. And so thank you for clarifying that role of the committee chair there. And when you talk about focus, that kind of brings us to our next point about really business strategy and how this really is part of the compensation committee meeting process. And so, I guess, David, how would you look at business strategy and how that should play into this process?
Well, so as you think about the discussions that you have to have in the committee and the committee chair trying to lay the groundwork, I think it's important to keep in mind on any of these decisions, particularly the more difficult ones, that compensation is supposed to drive business outcomes. So that in mind, you want your business strategy to be your North Star, if you will, in thinking about what's the right decision, what's the right direction to take. There are a lot of different considerations that come into play when you're making compensation decisions, and people in the room will have points of view on all of them: external input, proxy advisor reviews, shareholder feedback on say on pay, advisor input, lawyers, compensation consultants, et cetera. With all of that input, it can sometimes be easy to lose focus. I think that business strategy is where you come back to. Your business and your talent strategy guide the design of the compensation program, which means sometimes you may have to make some decisions that aren't exactly right down the middle of somebody else's checklist. So I think that's something important to keep in mind. It's context that we try to provide our clients pretty regularly. I'm sure you do it plenty of the time also, Andrew. Just making sure to point out where and how different decisions align with the company's unique situation, as opposed to just third-party checklists.
I agree, David. I think you've hit a critical point here. It's really about doing what's right for the business and supporting the organization's strategy. It's not falling into and following market norms or proxy advisor expectations. It's important to understand those pressures and influences, but ultimately do what's right for your business and ensure that your compensation supports the business strategy.
Yeah, that's great, and definitely makes sense. Yeah, the strategy always coming back to that as the North Star. Another question around process would be really executive session, and does the CEO or VP or HR, do they participate in these meetings, or what does that look like from a meeting standpoint?
Well, so there are probably a couple of questions in there, but I think the main one that I'd like to get across is the fact that executive session is a critical element, should be an element of every compensation committee meeting. Sometimes there may not be anything sensitive to discuss in executive session, but it should be an expectation that the committee always has some time to themselves without management in the room, sometimes without third-party advisors in the room, to discuss views openly on certain decisions that are being put in front of them. Where you don't have executive session as an expectation, it can create a feeling of mistrust when somebody suddenly calls an executive session, because everybody who's being sent out of the room is wondering, well, this doesn't always happen. Why? What is it they have to discuss that we can't be in the room for? But when it's an expectation and it's built in, this is just part of the process, and it's a good process. I think it helps maintain trust that Andrew mentioned when he was talking about communicating regularly. And executive session doesn't necessarily happen at the end of every meeting. Sometimes it could happen at the beginning of the meeting. It can be a very helpful tool to gather everybody's views before bringing management into the room to discuss whatever's being proposed. So it's important to make executive session a regular part of the process.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. And it definitely makes sense there, how if you spring that on somebody, you just pull it because you feel like you need it, then it can create some weird feelings. If it's expected to be a regular thing, then it's just part of the process. So love that viewpoint.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can imagine, right? I mean, somebody calls an executive session when they don't normally. You're standing outside the room, and the longer it goes on, the more you start wondering what's up. It's not a situation that you want to get into. So you want to get in the habit of doing that regularly.
Nice, love that. The next kind of real process we talked about, or Andrew, you really hinted at early on, is the use of an annual calendar. And so can you maybe dive a bit more into explaining the importance of that and how you use that?
Yeah, absolutely. The use of an annual compensation committee calendar, I think, is really important. When companies use a calendar, they usually set it up to follow the meeting and public disclosure cadence. So what it does is it helps to lay out the events during the year to manage the compensation cycle, especially for, say, the fourth and the first quarter meetings that have a really super heavy agenda with items that are critical to the annual reporting and compensation cycle. The calendar also helps to plan and take advantage of downtime in the second and third quarter meetings, and really to help make sure that agenda items are not missed during the year. It's a really great tool to use, and I think it's important for every committee to have an annual committee calendar in place.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Andrew, that I think it's helpful to have that calendar in the back of every committee book to remind committee members what to expect. I mean, you'll have committee members who are on several boards, and it's helpful to remind them not only what are we reviewing, what are we asking for approval for today, but when will we be reviewing other topics, right? So it helps them set expectations on when to be ready to review and think about certain topics. When will they be asked for approval? And it makes sure to keep today's conversation focused, because they can look and say, oh, this other thing I was thinking about, it's on the calendar for, they have a question about director pay in some meeting. Well, that's in the next meeting. Actually, we're going to be reviewing that. We do it every year on this timing. It's helpful to set those expectations and keep everybody focused on what we're doing today.
Yeah, and David, I like that you've mentioned to have that calendar included in the appendix, for example, of the material at every meeting. That's a great reminder at every meeting on what items are on the calendar for the year, what's been covered and what's upcoming. Completely agree. There's another great tool that I think every committee should have in the appendix as well, and that's the compensation dashboard. The dashboard it's like a cheat sheet. It's a one or two pager that helps keep board members informed about the compensation program. Many board members are involved on several boards and usually on many committees. So remembering details about the compensation program or getting details confused with other boards that the members sit on sometimes happens. Even directors that sit on a single board. Today's compensation programs are often fairly complex. So the dashboard can be really helpful even for a board member that's on a single board. The dashboard really summarizes all the key elements of the compensation program for the named executive officers. It's that high-level summary of the details and the dynamics of the program that provides that handy context that's readily available at every meeting that for board members to use as a reference tool.
Right. I mean, it can be invaluable, and you can invariably, when management or the consultant my experience has come up with a dashboard, directors are so grateful. So any compensation team who wants to build some extra goodwill with the compensation committee, if you don't have it, put together a good, succinct compensation dashboard. The board will love it.
I love that. The annual calendar, the dashboard, two very practical tools that anybody can use in there. Another point that we want to hit on here is really just, external optics, especially around those like challenging decisions and everything there. And so how should companies be preparing or thinking about optics whenever they get into a decision that could be challenging when viewed externally? What kind of processes or recommendations do you have for going through that?
Well, along with some of the other points that we've mentioned already, with carefully vetting issues, taking multiple bites at the apple, another thing that you want to do is to think about how this is going to sound when you have to disclose it. One way I like to put it is, when I say this out loud, how does it sound? So you can get into conversations focusing on the business strategy, the talent strategy, the individuals involved, in order to come to the right decision for the organization. But you do at some point have to step back and think about how this is going to sound when you put it out in front of shareholders and other third parties who are going to review this information. They're not wagging the dog, but they still have an important voice in how this comes across. And unhelpful noise, if you will, or pushback from not communicating these decisions well can cause noise that can distract from what the organization is really trying to do from a business standpoint. So it can be particularly helpful in challenging decisions to come to the committee with a draft of what this will look like when it shows up in an 8K, or when it shows up in the proxy, what will the number in the table be? What will the narrative be around this decision? And what are the potential, pitfalls that we may run into when this gets put out there? I think those are all very important things to understand. They won't necessarily change the decisions, but you need to know how this decision will sound when you say it out loud.
I completely agree with that, and I think it's really, really important to prepare this draft disclosure when you're dealing with an issue that's controversial, such as a substantial retention award. You really want to ensure that you see what that disclosure looks like. Have you provided a clear and compelling and disclosable rationale for the decision that you made around that retention award? And preparing that draft disclosure in advance really lets everybody have a look at how this is going to be communicated to investors and shareholders, and frankly, the proxy advisors as well, and whether you'll be able to get points on how you disclose this to the market relative to proxy advisor policies and voting recommendations. Another area where drafting this disclosure in advance is really helpful is it helps you to avoid unexpected outcomes. For example, a large one-time retention award to a specific executive or officer might push that individual into the top 5 named executive officers that need to be disclosed in the proxy circular. And without this draft prepared in advance, it may be a complete surprise that this executive or officer is required to be included in those top 5 executives after the end of the year. So it can really help in catching some of those unexpected outcomes that normally you wouldn't discover until you're actually heavy into drafting the proxy circular.
This is super helpful to understand the consequences, thinking through those optics, thinking through how that is going to be seen before you put it out there. Which I guess kind of leads to a final question here is, should a committee have an advisor, someone external helping them on this? And, what should that advisor, what role should they be playing in the process, or what should they be good at doing?
I think every company should have an independent advisor, and many companies actually do have an independent advisor to the committee. The advisor can provide assistance in a number of ways, some great examples where the advisor can provide a lot of value to an organization is in preparing a memo in advance of each committee meeting, which summarizes the materials and provides comments on areas that warrant more in-depth review or consideration or discussion by the committee. Another area where the independent advisor can add a lot of value is commenting on more difficult decisions. Independent advisors have a lot of experience. We can bring a lot of context on a challenging or difficult issue. We can help with providing some insights on the likely reaction of investors, stakeholders, and the proxy advisors as well. And we can also add a lot of value just by keeping the committee up to speed or abreast of marketplace trends, regulatory and government developments, and best practices around executive compensation and related governance matters.
Right. I mean, I think that there are a number of items we've actually brought up in this conversation where a very good independent outside advisor is a critical part of making those things happen, helping to facilitate that ongoing conversation, providing input and suggestions on compensation dashboards and annual calendars, reflecting back to the committee what the advisor has heard discussed from somebody who's not as maybe not as invested in some of the individuals, or is able to really step back and from a truly independent point of view say, this is what it sounds like. This either does or doesn't align with the way that I understand your business strategy. This will look or not look odd to these other people who are looking over your shoulder. I think it's important context that third party advisor can provide to help make the process run more smoothly and to fill any gaps, ask the questions that we don't hear being asked by others in the room.
That's right, David. And I think we play a great role. An independent advisor plays a great role often in bringing management and the committee, I guess, toward agreement or consensus on an issue or an important matter.
So as we wrap up here, what are any final thoughts or recommendations? And another way maybe look at this is, what are some of the consequences if someone doesn't go through these processes and they don't properly prepare? Any final thoughts here?
I mean, one thought that I would have is to go back to Andrew's first point, which is to communicate. You have very few opportunities during the year to get the attention of these very busy people who are making important decisions for your compensation program that will impact your business and talent strategy. A lot of work goes into putting these recommendations and plan designs together, and you have 4 to 5 scheduled opportunities of about 2 to maybe 3 hours each to get these decisions made and be able to move forward. You want to make the most of that time, and I think communicating regularly and openly is critical to making sure that happens.
I agree, David, and I think another final thought is that if you don't have many of these processes in place, then you're going to have a lack of preparation, which is going to lead to, it could lead to failure to come to consensus on an issue. It could lead to being more reactive and much less optimal in a compensation decision. I've seen cases where management comes to a committee meeting with a proposal that has not been socialized, has not been reviewed, has not been discussed with the committee chair or the committee in advance. And management has the expectation that the issue or the item will be approved and moved forward. And what can happen is the committee may ask for more information. They may not like the proposal at all and may reject it. And management needs to go back to the drawing board, and it just results in a much less optimal and repetitive process. than desired.
Yeah, and I think one of our other colleagues put well one of the consequences of not properly preparing the other day, and that is that poor preparation results in more expensive decisions also. All right, so when you're more reactive and you're less thoughtful about how you get there, you not only create the kind of disruption that Andrew just mentioned, which can take a while to get over those episodes and build trust back up, but you end up doing things like making one-off grants, retention awards to people, trying to hire people from outside because your own internally developed talent has lost faith in the process or the compensation committee. They go somewhere else. Things become more expensive. They become more disruptive. And a part of your program that's supposed to drive business performance starts hampering it. And I think that's the really big thing you're trying to avoid.
That is extremely well said. So thank you, David and Andrew, for everything you both shared today. This was super insightful and appreciate you both taking the time.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you very much.